All right, somebody review for us what we talked about last week. What was the main word? Started with a D, ended with deception. What was it? Deception. That was it. What about it? Somebody review. Help. Somebody, please. We're not moving anywhere until we review this, because Hannah wasn't here and she needs to know what was said.
When used for righteousness, it's obviously not sinful.
All right, when deception is used for righteousness, it's obviously not sinful. So Justin said it's okay to lie if it's used for righteousness. That's exactly what he just said. But no, really kind of. And we went to all those Old Testament texts where all these people were doing that. We talked about the women, how they lied to Pharaoh, the midwives at the Egyptian firstborn son stuff. What else we talk about? Jehu, and when she drove the tent peg through the dude's head. What else was there? Yeah, Judah and Tamar, that whole story. And the reason we got on that was because here in chapter 19 of 1 Samuel, Michal, or whatever her name is, she deceives the messengers of Saul to protect David, the rightful heir. And we were talking about whether or not that was sinful or not. And my clear case is that it was no, and there are 500 people. But we talked about the story of deception, and we went to Timothy, how Paul talked about how the woman at the very beginning was deceived in the garden, how it was the tactic of those who were against the covenant line of Israel, how deception was the tactic used against them, and an eye for eye, tooth for tooth principle under the old covenant allowed the line, essentially, to deceive them back. And I had a friend message me. Justin messed up the recording last week, so we only got the first half. I'm not mad at you, Justin. No big deal. Do we fix that today? We fixed it. You're the best, man. I don't care what Brooke says about you. Deception was used by the godly line against them. And I had a friend message me and say, hey, he's like a proper friend. He's not like Jordan and Travis and Josh who give me a hard time all the time. But he wanted to tell me that I missed something, but he said it in a nice way. He's like, have you thought about this? And what he really meant was, you should have said this, you dummy, but you didn't think about it. So the righteous line deceiving in the New Testament. We talked about how the Old Covenant system wanted to deceive the believers to go back under the Old Covenant system, but they used deception, and one of the things that he pointed out was Jesus' use of parables, and how the parables were deception to hide the truth of the kingdom from those whose eyes were veiled, connected still to the Old Covenant system. And I was thinking about the parables of Jesus. In Romans chapter 11, verse 8, Paul's quoting the Old Testament and a situation then, but he's applying it to the first century unbelieving Jews specifically, and he says to them that God had given them a spirit of stupor, and that's deception, essentially, that He hid it from them. So this idea of deception was all over the place. I want to talk about something different today, and I need to mention this. In Revelation chapter 17 and 18, Babylon the harlot was deceiving the nations. I have Babylon the harlot in the book of Revelation as the Old Covenant system, trying, instead of leading people to Yahweh, deceiving them and leading them away from Yahweh. That's 100% clear to me as Jesus Christ dying and rising from the dead. I mean, that's a no questions asked, no-brainer, textual stuff. But today I want to talk about another theme and motif that's everywhere in the Bible, and it's the Exodus motif. And there's an Exodus that's occurring in 1 Samuel 19 and 1 Samuel 20, and the Exodus is this. David has married into the house of Saul. Saul gave David his daughter, Michal. He's part of his house. Now David is going to supersede over this house. Now think about how good David would have had it in this house. He would have had all the riches of Saul's kingdom, all the riches of Saul's family, all the riches of Saul's dynasty. But instead of enjoying that pleasure, David's going to forsake it because he knows he's in sin against Yahweh, and he's going to leave it, and he's going to be exalted and superseded over it. Can you think of another pre-David Old Testament example of someone who was in a privileged house and chose to leave it and forsake it and wound up superseding it and that house being subverted to it? Can you think of somebody else in the Old Testament? Exactly. Moses. Moses is the story. And I think it's Hebrews 11 and 12 that talks about how Moses despised the riches of Pharaoh and all of that in unbelief and left it. He had his own exodus, by the way. When Moses leaves the house of Pharaoh, he's gone to the backside of the wilderness in Midian. Do you know how many years he was there with Jethro, his father-in-law? 40 years. A whole wilderness, Exodus motif idea before he returns to Pharaoh. The judgment comes upon the house of Pharaoh. And just stop and think about it all just for a second. Moses is persecuted by Pharaoh, the firstborn son idea. Same thing's going to happen to Jesus. We're going to go there in just a second to Matthew chapter 2. But this whole Exodus motif is everywhere. If I take a guitar and let's say, I don't know, this is how I think about the Bible. Because you got 500 million things going on in the Bible and you're trying to figure out what's going on in the Bible. And it's like, how do all these things tie in together? Well, if I take this guitar and I start in, this is the key of G right there. If I'm in the key of G, there's only so many places I can go. I can't go to 500 million different places. I'm only going to go to E minor or C or D or A minor, sometimes a B. Rarely. There's only so many places I can go because these things fit in a pattern. And if I start in a different key, then those rules apply the same way. When you're thinking about the Bible, I would encourage you to think the same way. Yeah, I've got 500 million Old Testament stories. But if I know the outline of the book, then these things are going to flow properly from them. So when I'm reading 1 Samuel 19 and 20, the first thing that's coming to my mind is David's following the same pattern as the rest of the Bible. And it's just doing it maybe a little different way. Look at verse 1. Saul spoke to Jonathan, his son, and to all his servants, that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted greatly in David. Now let's stop for a second. When Saul dies, who's going to inherit the kingdom rightfully under the Old Covenant system? Who's going to get it? Jonathan. So Jonathan told David, saying, my father Saul seeks to kill you. And if he's telling him that, he's siding with him. We'll see that more in this text. Therefore, please be on your guard until when? Underline it, circle it, highlight it, scream it, spit on it. I don't care what you do right there, okay? Like, make that stand out. Why? Because mourning is an Exodus motif. When do they leave in the Exodus? In the morning. When does Abraham meet Melchizedek? In the morning. When does Lot flee from Sodom? In the morning. I mean, just it's morning after. When did Jesus and they come to the tomb and realize? In the morning. Okay, like it's all there. Morning, morning, morning. Exodus motif. Stay in a secret place and hide. I'll go out and stand beside my father in the field. Emphasize, circle that, where you are. And I will speak with my father about you. Then what I observe, I'll tell you. Now, what's interesting in this text, Peter Leithart points out, is that Jonathan's going to have the opportunity, like Cain, to kill the new Abel David in the field. But he's not going to do it. He's going to be a righteous and better example of that. Verse 4. Thus Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and he said to him, let not the king sin against his servant, against David, because he's not sinned against you. He has not sinned against you. Jesus, I find no fault in this man. Pilate said, because his works have been very good toward you. For he took his life in his hands and killed the Philistine. He was fighting on behalf of you, Saul. And the Lord brought about a great deliverance, that word's used for Jesus in the New Testament, for all Israel. And you saw it and you rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood and kill David without a cause? Emphasis in that text. So Saul heard the voice of Jonathan and he swore, as the Lord lives, he won't be killed. Liar, deception. So then Jonathan called David. He told him all these things. Now Jonathan at this point, I feel like, really believes that Saul's not going to kill him, but Jonathan should know better because back in chapter 14, Saul's already tried to go against his own son, and David's got to do something to make Jonathan realize, hey dude, your dad is in the wrong here. He's out to get me. I know that you want to make covenant with me and be on teams and sides with me, but not so for your dad. Jonathan called David and told him these things, and Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as in times past. And there was war again, and David went out and fought with the Philistines and struck them with a mighty blow, and they fled from him. Now the distressing spirit of the Lord came upon Saul, as he sat in the house with his spear in his hand, and David was playing music with his hand. Now remember, what was the movie or whatever, the series, whatever they are, a lot of times they'll bring David in and he's like playing behind a curtain and Saul doesn't know that it's David and that whole deal because of the chronology that we talked about a couple weeks ago, because in 1 Samuel 17, Saul doesn't know who David is, but he did in 1 Samuel 16. So they got it to where he didn't, like when he was playing, he didn't know who he was. I disagree with that completely. Watch this. Then Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he slipped away from Saul's presence. I think he tried to nail him essentially to the wall, to the wood, but it didn't happen. And he drove the spear into the wall. So David fled and escaped that night. Saul also sent messengers to David's house to watch him and to kill him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed. Remember, midnight theme in the Exodus. So Michal let David down through a window. We went back to Jericho, where Rahab did the same thing. We went to Acts 9, where Paul was let down through the window. Same stories, deception here by the righteous against the enemy. Michal let David down through a window. He fled and escaped. And Michal took an image, watch this, laid it in bed and put a cover of goat's hair for his head and covered it with clothes. 3 things stick out to me, 4 things really. Number 1, David's escape is going to be at morning. Number 2, the decision is made at midnight. Number 3, it's an exodus because it's an escape away from Saul's house. Number 4, what'd she put in the bed? She put a substitute for David in the bed. And it was a goat skin. To say it another way, it was a lamb or a goat. And if the goat skin's laying in the bed, what had to have happened to that lamb or to that goat? It had to have been killed. There's your Passover theme in it. There's your sacrificials. That's Exodus motif. There's your Passover lamb laying in the bed as a substitute for David. It's all there. So when Saul sent messengers to take David, she lies, deceives, says he's sick. And this is what Justin was getting at. I don't think she's in sin for doing so. Saul sent the messengers back to see David, saying, bring him to me in the bed, that I may kill him. When the messengers came in, there was the image in the bed with the cover of goat's hair for his head. Saul said to Michal, why have you deceived me like this and sent my enemy away so that he has escaped? Now stop for a second. Pharaoh tries to kill Moses. Moses flees and escapes. Saul, the new Pharaoh, tries to kill the righteous David, the new Moses. David flees and escapes. Is everybody following me so far? How does he escape? Through deception. Verse 18. So David fled and escaped and went to Samuel at Ramah. Underline, circle, Ramah. This is huge. When Jacob marries Rachel, they're on their way somewhere, and Rachel dies at Ramah of Benjamin. All right? Josh, what he taught last week to the kids, when Jeconiah leads the people into sin and they get exiled to Babylon, there's a port city essentially 5 miles north of Jerusalem, and it's called Ramah. It's the same place. They all go to Ramah and then head to Babylon. Anytime you see Ramah in the Bible, you need to think Exodus, escape, motif, because that's always where they were going. Jeremiah 31:15, Jeremiah prophesies and says, look, there's going to come a day again, essentially, where the children are going to be exiled and dead, and a deliverer is going to come. Jeremiah 31:15 predicts that. Watch this. David fled and went to Samuel. This is where Samuel lives, at Ramah. And he told him all that Saul had done. And he and Samuel went and stayed at Naioth, and it was told Saul, saying, take note, David is at Naioth in Ramah. All right, I want to pause right there. Turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 2. I want you to see Ramah come up in the New Testament. Now remember this. Pharaoh tries to kill Moses. Moses escapes. The new Pharaoh, Saul, the wicked, tries to kill David. David escapes. When you get to the New Testament, Herod is doing the same thing to Jesus that Pharaoh did to Moses and Saul did to David. Pharaoh's the new picture of Herod is the new picture of the Pharaoh and the Saul figure. Herod gives the decree, we're going to kill all the firstborn children, just as Pharaoh gave the decree. We're going to essentially kill all the firstborn children. Watch all of the imagery that comes back up that we've been talking about, and this is why I say you can see the story of Christ in the life of David. Jesus as a baby when Herod's trying to kill him. Verse 13 in Matthew 2. When they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, arise, take the young child and his mother, flee to Egypt. Stay there until I bring you word. For Herod will seek the young child to destroy him, just as Saul's doing to David. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by, there you go, there's your Exodus theme, and departed for Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet. And he quotes Hosea 11:2, which you would read and say, that has nothing to do with Jesus, but Matthew applies it that way. Out of Egypt I called my son. Now watch the next part. Then Herod, remember, he calls the wise men, he tells the wise men, go find out where he is, and then do what? Come back and tell me. Do the wise men come back and tell him? So what'd they do? It says it right here in the text. Then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry. And he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem in all its districts, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men. How did the wise men from Babylon know that the Messiah was to be born? They're nowhere near Jerusalem. How did they know? Because there was an old boy named Daniel who got exiled to Babylon. These wise men come from the east. They knew the 70 weeks of Daniel, the prophesied time for when the Messiah would be born, so they're counting it down and they're coming. Remember, when you get to the New Testament in places such as John 1, they're expecting Messiah to come during that time because Daniel laid it out and predicted it back in Daniel chapter 9. So when you read passages like John 1, where Philip says to Nathanael, behold, we have found him of whom it is written in the law and the prophets, Jesus of Nazareth. Well, they found him because they were looking for him. Why were they looking? Because the Old Testament predicted the time when the Messiah would come. That's pretty simple. So anyway, verse 17. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, a voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation and weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted, because they are no more. Let me say it this way. When David flees to Ramah, essentially he just died. He got exiled. He just experienced death to the house of Saul. Does that make sense, everybody? He's done. Remember, separation, exile, represents death. In the presence of something represents life. This is good news. So it's not by chance that they go down to Ramah. Now let's go back to 1 Samuel 19. Any questions or thoughts so far by anybody? Got a question? Ask it. All right. Verse 19 in 1 Samuel 19. Now it was told Saul, saying, take note, David's at Naioth and Ramah. Saul sent messengers to David. When they saw the group of prophets prophesying and Samuel standing as leader over them, the Spirit of God came upon the messengers, and they also prophesied. When Saul was told, he sent other messengers, and they prophesied likewise. Saul sent messengers again the third time, by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, and they prophesied also. So he's like, all right, well, let's see what's going on here. Let me go down myself. Then he, verse 22, Saul, also went to Ramah and came to the great well that is at Seku. So he asked, where are Samuel and David? Now, I've made this point a couple weeks ago. I'll make it again. Wells in the Bible represent water. Water represents the Spirit, per John 7. Wells represent covenant life. The man who has been appointed, anointed, and set apart, Saul, has to go somewhere else now to drink of covenant life and covenant water. Did you get that? He shouldn't have to do that, but he does. And he's got to go to David and Samuel in order to do it. Look with me in the middle of 22. Someone said, indeed, they are at Naioth and Ramah. So he went there to Naioth at Ramah, and the Spirit of God was upon him also. And he went on and prophesied until he came to Naioth and Ramah. All right, this is interesting. This next part tells the whole story. Verse 24. And he, Saul, stripped off his clothes and prophesied before Samuel in like manner. He laid down what? Naked all that night. Huge emphasis here. Please get this. When someone is clothed in the Bible, they are clothed in righteousness, in good covenant standing. When someone is naked in the Bible, they are in shame and in trouble. Perfect example, back in the garden, Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve had not sinned and broken the covenant. They were naked but had not sinned. Therefore, they were naked and not in shame. Does that make sense, everybody? Once Adam and Eve sinned, what's the text tell us? Adam realized that he was naked and he was found in Shame. Why? Because he knew he couldn't cover his sin. What does Adam do in Genesis chapter 3? He takes the fig leaves and covers it himself. However, when he takes the leaves and covers himself, that covering is not sufficient. Adam must leave the garden and is exiled like Israel out of the land. Does that make sense? But Genesis 3 tells you the rest of the story. What does God do at the end of Genesis chapter 3? He kills an animal and clothes them himself with his clothing. Therefore, they're not naked, they're clothed, and they're not in shame. Does that make sense? That's a hard concept, and if you don't think covenantally about the Bible, you won't get that. But pause for a second and go over to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. I want you to see this. This is good. Ask a question, Josh. I don't think it's the initial old covering from the animals. I think it's possible Genesis 3 is prophetic in telling the rest of the story. Here's the way I got it. I think that their own covering, okay, remember, the old covenant represents physical things that they built themselves. To say it another way, it was a covering made with hands, by their own hands. The other covering was a covering from God, clothed without hands, a covering that they did not do. The whole point of the Bible is to say, when you realize that you're in sin and in shame, you can't cover it yourself by adding more good works to it. That's the whole old covenant system. It's only a teaching tool to make you realize you need supernatural help from God in order to be clothed and not be found naked. So even though you're a sinner, you can be clothed in the protection and provision of God and have upright covenantal standing before God because your sins have been covered by God, not something else that you did. And I think that's what Genesis 3 points to, and that's exactly what Paul gets to in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Turn over with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And yes, I think that the text in Samuel telling us that Saul was naked and stripped his clothes off, I think it's all pointing. Do I think that literally happened? Yes. Do I think he's laying there butt naked on the floor? Yeah, I think that. Is it pointing to something else? Yes, it has to be. That's how the text works. All right, verse 1 in 2 Corinthians 5. In the earthly house here, I take to be the house of the old covenant, which would be the temple in the old covenant setting. Okay, watch this. This is good. If you don't get anything else to say, get this for the next 5 minutes. For we know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Josh, what did you teach the kids last week? You said it earlier. Ephesians 2. What's Ephesians 2 say? You are the temple of God. The new covenant temple is a spiritual temple made without hands, built by God. What Paul is telling them is, if the temple that's standing in Jerusalem is destroyed, God's not going to leave you without a covenantal place to worship. He's going to clothe you with something else, something better. He's going to clothe you with a temple from heaven, the new covenant spiritual temple. That's what He's going to give you, a house eternal in the heavens. Verse 2. For in this, in the old covenant system, they groaned. Why were they groaning in the old covenant system? Because the old covenant only ever led to death. It couldn't get them face to face with God because that covering, that way of worship was not good enough. It never paid for sins. It's like a credit card. It bought you more time. But they were earnestly desiring to be clothed with their habitation, a new clothing, which is from heaven. You ever read the New Testament in Philippians and Colossians and all these other places and say, why does Paul keep telling them to clothe themselves with Christ, put on Christ? Were they physically putting on Christ? No, but they were staying into that new covenant doctrine and trusting in the Lord. That's how they were being clothed. And you and I, we hear the gospel preached, we realize that we're sinners in shame, and we're clothed immediately when we repent of our sins and come to faith in God. He clothes us with the righteousness of Christ. For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed with our habitation, which is from heaven. If indeed, having been clothed, we shall not be found what? They're not going to be found in shame. And if you've sinned and you're found unclothed and naked, what's coming? Judgment. But if you're clothed, what happens? You bypass the judgment. Just like in the Exodus. If you had the blood, which means you killed the lamb and were trusting in the lamb, if you had the blood on your door, you were covered. If you didn't have the blood, what happens? The firstborn son dies. Judgment. For we who are in this tent, the old covenant system, being burdened, remember what Jesus said in Matthew 23? He says, they lay heavy burdens on you that you can't fulfill. That was the old covenant. It was a teaching tool to show you can't fulfill it. Jesus said, come to me, all you who are weak and are heavy laden. My yoke is easy and my burden is... Why? Because He does the work for you in the new covenant and clothes you with Himself. Did everybody get that? It's good stuff. So here we go. Not being burdened because we want to be unclothed. Paul's not teaching that he wants to have no covenantal standing. He wants to be further clothed so that he can become immortal, meaning he can have everlasting life in Jesus. That mortality may be swallowed up by life. And then he goes on to talk about Christ. So, yeah, Zach, did you get all that out of verse 24 in 1 Samuel 19, where Saul strips off his clothes and he said he's naked? Yeah, I did. I got that out of there. Say, Zach, how'd you get that? I don't know. That's just the way I see it. That's what they're pointing to. Because I know what happens next in the text. Let's look at 1 Samuel chapter 20. Yeah, so Josh is saying that a lot of people read 2 Corinthians 5 and they think that have you ever heard anybody say, man, my back hurts and all this other stuff and we're just groaning in this body and we want to be out of this physical body and hurry up and get to heaven? Like, remember the Point of Grace song? We're kicking up dust, it's heaven or bust, we're headed for the promised land. From the moment we believed, we've been eager to leave, get off the earth and go to heaven like a child taking daddy's hand. That's not what the Bible's teaching. The Bible is not teaching that when we come to faith in Jesus, we want to hurry up and leave the earth. In the New Testament, they were wanting to be set free from the bondage, burden, and groaning of a lifestyle and a covenant that couldn't give them everlasting life. And they wanted to be delivered into the new covenant where they had everlasting life and immortality. They didn't want to be off the earth. They wanted in a better covenant. And friends, you got it. So if your mindset is, man, I'm a Christian, but I want to hurry up and get to heaven, you missed the whole point of the book, because that wasn't what any of them were looking for. In Hebrews 11 and 12 it says, Paul was looking for a city, and it's the city of Ephesians 2, the city being built by God. And I got news for you. In Revelation 21, guess what the city does? The city comes down. Remember what they prayed for in Matthew 6 in the Lord's Prayer? Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. The kingdom come where? To the earth. Congratulations. You've inherited the kingdom. You don't have to die to go to heaven to be in the kingdom. That's not the point of the book at all. It's not what we're teaching. It's a good point, Josh. All right, I got to go or I'm never going to finish. Wow. Then David fled from Naioth in Ramah, I'm in 1 Samuel 20, verse 1, and said to Jonathan, what have I done? What's my iniquity and what's my sin before your father that he seeks my life? And Jonathan, still being ignorant, says, by no means, you shall not die. Who does this sound like in the New Testament? There's one person that comes to my mind. Who is it? Peter. What are you talking about, Jesus? You're not going to die. And David understands. I have to die because it's not the dynasty, the family, or the house of Saul that's going to inherit the things of God forever. It's going to be a different house. Jesus has to die to the house he was born into. David was born into the house of Saul. Now he's going to die to the house of Saul and be superseded and raised over the house of Saul. Jesus in the New Testament, John 1, He came to His own did not receive Him. Galatians 4, He was born under the law. He's born into that house just as Moses was in the house of Pharaoh. He's exiled. Jesus is exiled, dies to the grave, is exiting out of that house and is going to be raised and superseded over that house. Saul doesn't get it. David and Jonathan understand it. Jonathan doesn't understand it yet, but he's about to. By no means, you shall not die. My Father will do nothing, either great or small, without first telling me. Why should my Father hide this from me? It's not so. So David's got to explain it to him. Look at verse 3. David took an oath again, saying, your father certainly knows I found favor in your eyes. And he has said, do not let Jonathan know this. He's kept it from him, lest he be grieved. But truly, as the Lord lives and your soul lives, there's but a step between me and death. Jonathan said to David, whatever you desire, I will do it for you. Now notice this. At the beginning, David is making a covenant with Jonathan. By the end of this, Jonathan realizes he's got to make a covenant with David. That's what Saul should have realized. And many people in Israel in the first century realized they had to leave one covenant and go to the next covenant. Did y'all get that? Jonathan is that picture of the righteous remnant in the first century who realizes the covenant housing change. But David said to Jonathan, "Indeed, tomorrow is a new moon." There's a festal calendar. "I should not fail to sit with the king to eat." So David's supposed to come eat at the house and the table of Saul, and he's not going to do it. He says, "Let me go that I may hide in the field until the third day." There we go, Exodus motif again, "at evening. If your father misses me at all, then say, David earnestly asked permission to me that he might run over to Bethlehem, his city. There's a yearly sacrifice for all the family." Now, if there's a yearly sacrifice, what's that mean they're also going to do? If they kill something, what are they going to do? They're going to eat it. There's a feast. The last time there was a big feast at Bethlehem and Samuel was there, Saul knows David was anointed and set up as the king. So something's going on. That's why he's going to tell him that. If he says, "Thus it's well," your servant will be safe. He's not going to harm me. But if he's angry, be sure to know, Jonathan, that evil is determined by him. Therefore you shall deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. Nevertheless, if there is sin in me, kill me yourself, for why should you bring me to your father? But Jonathan said, "Far be it from you. For if I knew certainly that evil was determined by my father to come upon you, would I not tell you?" David said to Jonathan, "Who will tell me? Or what if your father answers roughly?" Jonathan said to David, "Let us go into the field." Both of them went into the field. Jonathan said to David, "The Lord God of Israel is my witness. When I have sounded out my father, or figured out his plan, sometime tomorrow, or the third day, indeed there is good toward David, and I do not send and tell you, may the Lord do so, and much more to Jonathan. But if it pleases my father to do you evil, I'll report it to you and send you away, that you may go into safety." Did y'all get that? If I don't come to you in 3 days, David, you're safe. He's not going to kill you. But if I send you a sign, then know he's going to kill you and you got to get out of here. "The Lord be with you as he's been with my father." Verse 14. "You shall not only show me kindness of the Lord while I still live, that I may not die, but you shall not cut off your kindness from my" what? "House forever. No, not when the Lord has cut off every one of the enemies from David from the face of the earth." Jonathan realizes if David is the rightful heir of the kingdom, then all of the enemies, this is precursor in the book, and even pagans did this. When you inherited the line, or took over a kingdom, if there was anybody left from the previous dynasty, you just axed them. Why? Because you don't want to give a resurrected life to that dynasty. But Jonathan knows it's not his to inherit, it's David. So what's he do? He makes a covenant and a treaty, and he says, "Not only my house, but my descendants also, David. I'm with you. But you shall not cut off your kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord has cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth." So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "Let the Lord require it at the hand of David's enemies." So Jonathan's going to go to Saul now and eat at the dinner that David's supposed to be at. Verse 17. Are we good? I know I'm going quick, but are y'all following this story? Is this good? See how this connects to the New Testament? It's going to get better. I'm almost done. Jonathan again, that's probably not true. Jonathan again caused David to vow because he loved him. For he loved him as he loved even his own soul. Then Jonathan said to David, "Tomorrow is the new moon, and you'll be missed because your seat will be empty. When you've stayed 3 days, go down quickly and come to the place where you hid on the day of the deed, and remain by the stony Zell. I'll shoot 3 arrows to the side, as though I shot at a target. And there I'll send a lad, saying, 'Go find the arrows.' If I expressly say to the lad, 'Look, the arrows are on this side of you, go get them and come. As the Lord lives, there's safety for you and no harm.' But if I say thus to the young man, 'Look, the arrows are beyond you,' I guess David's going to hear him yell that, 'Go your way, for the Lord has sent you away. And as for the matter which I've spoken of, indeed the Lord be between me and you forever.' So David hides in the field. When the new moon had come, the king sat down to eat the feast. The king sat in his seat as at other times, on a seat by the wall. Jonathan arose and Abner by Saul's side, but David's place was empty. Nevertheless, Saul didn't say anything that day, for he thought something has happened to him. He's unclean. Surely he's unclean, so he can't come to the feast. And it happened the next day, the second day of the month, that David's place was empty. Saul said to Jonathan his son, notice what he calls him. Remember, Saul's given David his daughter So he's brought him into his house. But notice what he calls David here once he realizes something's wrong. Saul said to Jonathan his son, why has the son of Jesse, he doesn't identify him with him anymore, not come to eat, either yesterday or today? Jonathan answered Saul, David earnestly asked permission of me to go to Bethlehem. And he said, please let me go, for our family has a sacrifice in the city, and my brother has commanded me to be there. And now if I found favor in your eyes, let me get away and see my brothers. Therefore he's not come to the king's table. Communion table now different. Saul's anger was aroused against Jonathan and said, you son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know, watch this, that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own what? Shame, and to the shame of your mother's nakedness. For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, you shall not be established, nor your kingdom. Now therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die. Just as Pharaoh wanted to kill Moses, but you remember, what was the 10th plague in the Exodus? The death angel comes through, kills all of the firstborn sons of the Egyptians, specifically whose son does it emphasize that died? Pharaoh's son. Jonathan, the son of Saul, essentially this is the 10th plague. Saul realizes that this is the death plague. His dynasty is dead. And Jonathan knows it. He knows that he won't inherit the house, but it'll be the new Moses, David, who's going to take covenant control. Jonathan answered his father and said, verse 32, why should he be killed? What has he done? Saul cast a spear to him to kill him, by which Jonathan knew that it was determined by his father to kill David. Now remember what Jesus said? If they've done such and such to me, are they not going to also do it to you? And I'm also reminded here that Saul and Jonathan are at odds. That's father and son. And how many times in the Gospels does Jesus say, I've come to bring a sword. I've come to set father against mother and son against daughter and all these other things, right? That's the same idea. Well, what did Jesus mean when He said that? Well, whenever they believed in Jesus, they would be kicked out and exiled from their family, just like this. But Jonathan realizes the house of Saul will no longer have a place. Let me say it another way, that Saul's house is left desolate. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 23, 37, 38 to those religious leaders? See now, your house is left to you desolate. That's why Paul said in 2 Corinthians 5 that this house, the old covenant system, would be destroyed and a new house with a new leader, Jesus, the new David, would come. And that's where the covenantal clothing would come from. Did that make sense, everybody? Or was that way too much? Is it good? Following that? All right, let's finish. Verse 35, and so it was in the morning, David's going to flee, that Jonathan went out to the field at that time appointed with David. And the little lad was with him, and he said to the lad, now run and find the arrows I shoot. And the lad ran, he shot the arrow beyond him. When the lad had come to the place where the arrow was, which Jonathan had shot, Jonathan cried out after the lad and said, is not your arrow beyond you? And Jonathan cried out after the lad, make haste, hurry, don't delay. So Jonathan's lad gathered up the arrows and came back to his master, but the lad did not know anything. Only Jonathan and David knew of the matter. Jonathan gave his weapons to his lad, said, go take him to the city. As soon as the lad had gone, David arose from a place toward the south. He fell on his face. Did you get that? Where did David arise from? David comes up from the south. He comes up from the grave, and he's fixing to perform his exodus. He fell on his face to the ground. He bowed down 3 times. They kissed one another and wept together, but David more so. Then Jonathan said to David, go in peace, since we have both sworn in the name of the Lord, saying, may the Lord be between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever. So he arose and departed, and Jonathan went back to the city, back to his father's house. Now, if this follows the pattern of the New Testament, what's going to happen after Jesus ascends to His disciples and to His followers? And really, remember what Jesus said? If they persecute you, they're not persecuting you, but instead they're persecuting me. Did you get that? They're persecuting Jesus whenever they persecute you. Remember when Saul was hammering the church in Acts chapter 9 and he's going down to Damascus? Jesus comes to him and he says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Did you get that? So that's the pattern. So what should happen next to David and those who align with David coming from Saul for the next 40 years until David takes the throne? Persecution. And that's exactly what we'll get to. And that, look, I'm telling you, That's the way they're writing these books. They're laying them out to follow the New Testament. Because if you go over and look in your Bible, what's your next heading say in 1 Samuel chapter 21? What's your heading say? Mine says David and holy bread, but it's also going to get here to the point, depending on your translation, to where verse 22, chapter 22, you're going to get Saul persecuting David. And that's going to be the story of the whole deal. So let me lay it out this way. I really need to do one other thing. It's 10:30. Will y'all give me 5 more minutes? Can we go 5 more minutes and I promise I'll be done? Go to Hebrews chapter 2 because that's what the whole book of Hebrews is about. They're going nuts in there on Travis. Y'all hear them in there killing the walls? He's going to cuss me out. I'm kidding. He's not. All right. Let me explain this again. David is born into the house of Saul. David, because of Saul's sin and his rejection, David is going to leave and exit for a period. Saul's reign is 40 years. The New Testament from AD 30 to AD 70. From the point where Jesus is announced as king to when he actually comes in the full enthronement is a 40-year period. David's life is following that pattern. The time in between is the period of persecution until all the enemies are laid underneath his feet. The most quoted verse in the New Testament, Psalm 110:1. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. The book of Kings and Chronicles are going to be very prevalent. That David is going to place in his 40-year reign his enemies under his feet. Solomon will inherit the time of peace that represents the new heavens and new earth. So to say it this way, David's life and David's reign are going to mirror AD 30 to AD 70. Once the new heavens and new earth come in AD 70, that's typological of Solomon and the peace that he brings. The difference in Jesus and Solomon is that Jesus is better than Solomon because once he's established his kingdom, he's not going to go into sin and lead it back astray. But you've got to get this. Guys, please hear me say this. Do I believe Jesus Christ was born and came to the earth in a physical body? Yes. Do I believe that he died in a physical body and rose from a grave in a physical body? Yes. But that is not the emphasis of the text at certain times. The emphasis of the text is that Jesus was born into a house, like Saul's house. Jesus was born under the old covenant, and he was going to be superseded and exceed that old covenant. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 5. For he has not put the world to come of which we speak in subjection to angels. You see that? Now, I've read the Old Testament a lot. Hebrews 1 and 2 say that the angels were in charge of the old covenant. I ain't ever seen an angel offer a sacrifice. I ain't ever seen an angel go into the Holy of Holies. I ain't ever seen an angel do none of that stuff that all the people in the Old Covenant were doing. I think this is where we got to know a little bit about the Bible and understand some translation stuff. Malachi 2:7 uses the same word, angelos, in the Septuagint. When he says angels there in verse 5, and really I think in Hebrews 1 and 2, I don't think he's talking about supernatural being angels. Malachi 2:7 says that the priests were the angels of the Old Covenant. And it doesn't say priest, it says they were the ministers, but it's the same word. In the New Testament, they translated angels. In the Old Testament, they translated ministers. I think he's saying, I didn't put the world to come, the covenant world, in subjection to the Old Covenant priesthood. I gave it to Christ Jesus. He superseded and raised over that house, just as David and Moses were raised over Pharaoh and over the house of Saul. It's typological. He's not put the world to come, of which we speak, in subjection to angels. But one testified in a certain place, saying, this is Psalm 8, what's man that you're mindful of him, or the son of man that you take care of him? You've made him, and my translation says, a little lower than the angels. But if you click on the subscript in the New King James, it says, you've made him for a little while lower than the angels. What does that mean? A little while lower than the angels. David, for a little while, was lower than Saul, under the leaders of Saul's house and Saul's dynasty. Jesus, for a little while, was under that old covenant system. But he's going to be raised up so that all should come and worship at his feet. Jonathan knows that. Saul does not. There's only one way you avoid this. All bow at the feet of the righteous king. You either do it through submission, through faith and understanding, or you do it through judgment and destruction. You've crowned him with glory and honor and set him over the works of your hands. You put all things in subjection under his feet. For in that he put all in subjection under him, he left nothing that's not put under him. In their time, they did not yet see all things put under him. Why? They were still being persecuted by the old covenant system. But we see Jesus, who was made for a little while lower than the angels, the ministers of the old covenant, I take. Why? For the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that he, by the grace of God, might taste death for everyone. For it was fitting for him, whom are all things and by all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through sufferings. Just as David will suffer, so too Christ and his followers would. For both he who sanctifies and those being sanctified are all of one, for which reason he's not ashamed to be called. And I'll stop, but just go read Hebrews 2. It talks about how Christ would be elevated over it. Do y'all see how these stories tell the same thing and tell the same patterns? Questions, comments, concerns, thoughts? Nothing. Does that make sense? Did y'all follow that? Do you see how the old, y'all are liars. Do you see how the Old Covenant's typological of what's going on in the New Testament?
I think it would be good to clarify, at the end there, you made a comment about David's life pictures, New Testament from 30 to 70.
Yep.
You made a comment about but when the new heavens and new earth came in AD 70.
Yep.
I know you're teaching the Bible from a preterist perspective, but if there is anyone who doesn't understand that, it may seem
Yeah.
weird. I would clarify what you mean when we say new heavens and new earth.
Okay.
Came in AD 70.
So Saul's house, in my mind, is a creation. Okay? When the Bible talks about old creation, new creation, a lot of people read that lingo and they say, well, he's talking about the physical earth, right? Talking about physical earth, physical body, physical things. And I don't think that's the case at all. And y'all think this way, and you know it, and you've heard this in church your whole life. 2 Corinthians 5, Paul goes on to say in 17 to 21, if any man is in Christ, he is a new. That new creation is the new covenant that God made through Christ Jesus. So that new covenant comes in full when the old covenant, that house, is removed. That's why Paul said earlier in 2 Corinthians 5 that if the old house, the old covenant, the old heavens and earth is destroyed, we have a new house, a new covenant not made with hands, a new creation that comes in full. The Bible does this in patterns and periods of 40 years. It does it with David and Solomon. It does it with Moses. How old was Moses when he died? The text tells us at the end of it. Do you remember? How old was Moses? Anybody know? 120. Why 120? Because 120 divided by 3 is 40. For 40 years, Moses was in the house of Pharaoh. For 40 years, Moses leaves and goes to Midian. For 40 years, Moses goes from entering the wilderness to the establishment of Canaan. It patterns the whole thing. David's life does the same thing. You get the 40 years of David who's going to be running in the wilderness, then the 40 years of David when he's on the throne, whenever he's putting down the enemies in the millennium, then guess how long Solomon's going to reign as king? 40 years for the time period of the goodness of it. The problem is, it's still Old Covenant. Solomon's fallen. He's not perfect, so Solomon gets into sin and becomes a beast, so you get the whole repeat cycle. The reason you don't have a repeat cycle is because all those things are typological, and you finally get somebody who's not a sinner, who's perfect, who has the right to be king, that never plunges the covenant world back into sin. So he can reign forever, and his is the kingdom forever. For thine is the kingdom and power and glory and honor forever.
So to be clear,
Amen.
we equate as preterists, we equate the new heavens and new earth not as a physical, like the vast majority of people think, a physical recreation of the cosmos, but we equate new heavens and new earth to new covenant.
New heavens and new earth to new covenant. Made up of Jew and Gentile, which I don't believe today there's either Jew or Gentile. I think Jew and Gentiles came out of the old creation to form the new creation. I think now the way that you have a house, a spiritual house that's built, not a physical structure like they did in the old covenant, but you have a spiritual house that's built. Revelation 21 says the gates to that house are never closed, they're never shut. I take that to mean that they're open. I think we can come into that. How do we do it? Through faith, and we're clothed in the righteousness of Christ. I think that's what the text is teaching. To say it another way, the point of the Bible is not to get me from the beginning of world history to the end of world history. The point of the Bible is to show me how God made a covenant with man, Adam. He comes into covenant, and like all of Israel in the Old Testament, that man can't keep the covenant. So He's going to do away with that covenant, but give those in that covenant an opportunity to trust in the prophesied Messiah, if they're Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, or if they're living in the New Testament, to trust in Jesus. And He's going to bring in a better, perfect, righteous man who is able not only to stay in covenant, fellowship with God, which is what the garden represents. Jesus in John 20 is raised in a garden tomb. Just that symbolizes He's back into the presence of God. He's the first one to die to the old covenant system and come back fully into the presence of God. Therefore, He brings everybody else through faith into the garden. To say it another way, Adam was told to take dominion. He failed to do it. Jesus takes the dominion. Not only does He stay in covenant with God, He brings others through faith into covenant with God so that they never die. Not don't die physically, but never are exiled out of the presence of God. They never die spiritually. That's the point of the Bible, to show how God wanted to covenant with man, but man couldn't do it because God's holy and man's not. So He has to send His only Son, the true and better David, to keep us into covenant with Him. And like Jonathan, we should look to Christ and say, it's Him. We recognize that and not identify with anything else. That's what I think the point of the Bible is. Thank you, Jordan, for that. Anybody else have any thoughts you'd like to add before the end of this lesson? Thank you, Josh. Here we go.
It's laid out heaven, earth, sea. You have the same thing when you get to the temple system. Heaven, earth, and sea. The sea is the outer court of the Gentiles. When you get to the new heavens and new earth and you read Revelation, it says there's no more sea. There's no more Gentile because that distinction's been taken away in Christ.
That's why I said a while ago that there's no such thing today as Jew or Gentile. Those are categories that there were distinctions in the Old Covenant. A Gentile couldn't be a priest. A Gentile couldn't own land. There was something unique about Israel because Israel would bring forth the Messiah. Once the Messiah comes, all the barriers are broken down. So, remember in Acts 10 when Peter's told to go out to the sea and essentially get the wild animals and bring them in and the fish of the sea and bring them in. And he's talking about people on the outer skirts who weren't part of the covenant community. They weren't part of Israel. He's talking about going and getting the Gentile outsiders and bringing them in. Well, Paul says in Galatians 3 that there's neither Jew or Greek, male or female, slave or free, but all are one in Christ. Ephesians 2, he broke down the dividing wall between Jew and Gentile. When the Gentile was converted to Old Covenant Judaism and they came to the temple, they couldn't go into certain parts that the Jews could go into. Well, in the New Covenant, we're all on equal playing field. That's why Paul writes to the Gentiles in Ephesians chapter 1 and 2 and says, God has blessed you with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places. That's not a true distinction. Under the Old Covenant, the Gentiles didn't have all the spiritual blessings. So now, for us today, and this is why I look at Israel over there and say, that's not Israel. That's why today, like Josh said, in the New Covenant, there's no more sea. Why? Because everybody who's in the covenant is on the land, in the garden, in the presence of God. If you believe, you're in the presence of God. You could be in the Old Covenant. I'll stop with this. Don't say anything. In the Old Covenant, you could be in the Old Covenant and not be in right standing, not be a believer with God. Does that make sense? The priesthood in the first century is a perfect example. They killed Jesus. Are they in the Old Covenant? Are they true believers in God? No. The Presbyterians and others carry that doctrine over today and they say, look, our kids can be in the covenant even though they're not believers. And I say, no. Everybody who's in the New Covenant is in the presence of God. They're believers. Let's pray.